Good day. I'm Andrea Mitchell in New York. You have been watching a contentious House Judiciary Oversight hearing with testimony from Attorney General Merrick Garland, who's been pushing back when he has a moment to do so against months of public attacks by House Republicans about the Hunter Biden investigation. Joining me now is NBC senior Capitol Hill correspondent Garrett Haake, former U.S. Attorney Harry Litman, and Anthony Coley, former senior advisor to Attorney General Garland in the Justice Department. Garrett, this hearing has been very heated at times. Let's sum up what we've learned so far.
Well, I think the big takeaway is Merrick Garland would really like House Republicans to believe that he really, seriously, is not involved in the Hunter Biden investigation. And the decision to set up David Weiss as a U.S. attorney to continue investigating it was made before his tenure, and that ever since then he has been as hands-off as possible. Several Republican lawmakers have tried to get him to admit to other conversations or other kind of work on the margins or probed his curiosity or lack thereof into elements of the Hunter Biden case or into what's become the outline of the case they are trying to make in an impeachment inquiry against President Biden. But Garland has steadfastly denied, or excuse me, President Biden. Garland has steadfastly denied he's had any involvement in any of those issues and has tried to stay, on the fairway here, essentially, and not get drawn off onto those tangents for several hours now.
And Harry Litman, are you concerned that General Garland had difficulty answering some questions about possible interactions with the FBI and David Weiss, who was a holdover? He had kept him on as a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney in Delaware precisely because he said that he was not going to interfere politically and wanted to have the Republican appointee continue this investigation.
I don't think he had difficulty, Andrew, and his answers were very consistent. However, in many cases, the questioners refused to take no for an answer, causing him to have to say again and again, and trying to get him to veer into improper areas. There's a real kangaroo court aspect to it, though, because the questioners know that what they're posing really is not accurate, isn't legitimate, and so he varies sometimes from slightly fatigued feeling about here we go again to at times really showing his dander and pushing back hard. But basically his refrains, I think, been very consistent and steady, even if some of the Republicans have been trying to probe more deeply to areas that he just can't go into.
And just wanted to play something that he said from his opening statement about what his role is as the Attorney General and as an independent branch of government, trying actually to reestablish the independence of the Justice Department from the White House, which had been breached on many occasions in the previous administration. Let's watch.
Our job is not to take orders from the president, from Congress, or from anyone else about who or what to criminally investigate. I am not the president's lawyer. I will add, I am not Congress's prosecutor. The Justice Department works for the American people. We will not be intimidated.
Anthony Coley, you know the man very well. You worked for him. One of the things that Joe Neguse did try, Congressman Neguse from Colorado, tried to put in the record, at least, that he had a lengthy career as a prosecutor at Justice, the Oklahoma City bombings, the Atlanta Olympic bombings, a number of big cases, was eventually not only a federal judge, but the appeals court, and then was chief judge there, right under the Supreme Court. And of course, what he didn't mention, had been nominated by President Obama for the Supreme Court, but never even got a hearing because of what Mitch McConnell, as Republican leader, did at the time. So his record of public service, lifelong record, was something that the Republicans did not introduce, but that at least Democratic Congressman Neguse did, but you worked for him.
That's exactly right, Andrea. I think what we saw today was an attorney general who was prepared and ready to fight back, push back against these spurious allegations against this department, and also to make clear that politics has absolutely no way in DOJ decision making. Now, what also happened here, I think if I had to come up with one word to describe what we all just saw, is tension. And it's not just tension between Democrats and Republicans, but it's tension between the nature of criminal criminal investigations in the nature of political investigations. Criminal investigations, prosecutors follow the facts. The facts tell prosecutors where to go. With political investigations, members of Congress often start with the end in mind. Right? And then they try to conduct an investigation to fill in the blanks, to get the objective that they want. And so that's what's happened here. After months and months and months of trying to draw some type of connection between Hunter Biden and the Biden family and illicit activity, they come up with nothing. And that's what's on display. And I think American people are going to look through that.
But, I mean, there has been a lot of smoke because of what was really the botched plea agreement.
Yeah.
David Weiss's statement when there was an agreement that the investigation was still continuing, leading to a lot of implications and a lot of tension that has been reported recently behind the scenes between the White House and the Attorney General for the way he's handled the Hunter probe and also the probe into the president's classified documents case.
So I scratch my head every time I see these type of anonymous quotes coming from the White House for two reasons. Number one, the White House has one job right now, and that is to get Joe Biden reelected, which I support. The other thing here, too, is that the facts just don't match what these anonymous White House officials are saying. On the first case with Joe Biden and this special counsel looking into these classified documents, three things happened. On three different occasions from November 2nd through the first week of January, the president and his team voluntarily turned over classified documents, not once, not twice, not three times. That's more than enough evidence and background for this attorney general to appoint a special counsel. And with regard to the second special counsel that was appointed, people rightly note that David Weiss was originally appointed by Donald Trump. But what has gotten lost in this conversation is that this White House affirmatively asked or decided that Weiss be kept on. That's their prerogative. U.S. attorneys are presidentially appointed, and that's their right to do that. But that's gotten lost in all of this conversation.
A lot of other things have been lost as well. Anthony, thank you so much. Garrett, thank you. And